Most people think income investing begins when you are old, tired, and sitting on a pile of money large enough to make every ordinary problem disappear. I have never thought about it that way. I have always believed the first job of money is not to impress you, it is not to entertain you, it is not to make you feel clever at a dinner table. The first job of money is to make you harder to corner. That is why I pay attention when Wall Street creates a tool that changes the timing of cash flow. Most people are trained to think in months, monthly rent, monthly bills, monthly statements, monthly dividends, monthly pension checks. But fear does not arrive monthly. Bad markets do not ask permission before they show up. Sometimes they arrive in a single ugly week. Sometimes they arrive in a single Friday afternoon, and when a man is forced to sell good assets at a bad price just to cover ordinary life, he is no longer investing. He is negotiating with pressure. That is the danger most people describe badly. They talk about yield, they talk about retirement, they talk about passive income. But the real issue is control. If your groceries, electricity, insurance, medicine, and ordinary living costs force you to sell shares during a drawdown, your portfolio is not serving you. You are serving it. You are carrying market risk and sequence risk at the exact same time. And that combination ruins more retirements than people want to admit. So when I read a reference document about weekly paying ETFs built on Treasury bills, government money market exposure, and other rate-sensitive structures, I did not think this is a gimmick. I thought this is a timing tool, and timing tools matter more than people realize. The crowd likes to start at the exciting end of the table. They want the huge yields, they want the dramatic screenshots, they want to believe there is a magical ticker somewhere that can turn impatience into freedom. I have spent my life watching what happens to people who reach for income before they build a floor. They do not build freedom. They build fragility. So if I were talking to a serious investor in 2026, I would start with one sentence and I would repeat it until it became part of their operating system. Before you chase a higher stream, build a weekly floor. That is the master line under everything I am going to say. Before you chase excitement, build a weekly floor. Before you chase a giant payout, build a weekly floor. Before you tell yourself some story about quitting work, replacing a salary, or beating the market with income products, build a weekly floor. Because the floor changes your behavior. The floor changes your fear. The floor changes the number of stupid decisions you make when the market gets rough. If you understand that, you already understand more about income investing than a great many people who can recite 10 tickers and still cannot sleep at night. The reference document makes a point I wish more people understood. Products come and go. Funds that looked clever 2 years ago vanish, get liquidated, or become ghost tickers. Newer investors still go hunting for long after the story is dead. That matters. It matters because income chasers often buy ideas after the idea itself is already broken. They are not buying income, they are buying a memory. That is why I never begin with the label, I begin with the engine. What produces the cash flow, how stable is the source, what legal claim is underneath it, what can go wrong, how much complexity is hiding behind the yield, how much of the payment is coming from genuine income, and how much is compensation for risk people have not bothered to measure. Those questions matter more than the headline number. If the engine is weak, the income is an illusion. If the engine is strong, even a modest yield can become a powerful strategic tool. Now, let us talk about why a weekly payment matters. When you get paid quarterly, life still happens weekly, markets still move daily, fear still arrives instantly. Even a person with decent assets can feel pressure between payouts. They may know their portfolio is sound over a year, but in the short term they still need cash. And if the only way to get that cash is to sell something after a 12% drawdown, the math stops being elegant. It becomes painful. A weekly floor solves part of that problem. It does not eliminate market risk. It does not turn a poor portfolio into a strong one. It does not make someone disciplined overnight. But it changes the rhythm. It reduces the number of moments where a person says, I need money now, and the market is down now, so I have to sell now. That is a very expensive sentence. Avoiding that sentence is worth more than many people realize. The second reason a weekly floor matters is behavioral compounding. Everybody talks about compounding as if it is only a formula. It is not. It is also a structure. The faster capital is put back to work, the less time it spends sitting idle waiting for the investor to feel confident, inspired, or optimistic. Weekly cash flow shortens the distance between payment and redeployment. That does not sound glamorous, but neither did insurance when I first started buying it. Still, boring things that reduce friction tend to become wealthy things over long periods. If a person is accumulating, weekly reinvestment can put small amounts back into motion faster than monthly reinvestment. If a person is living off income, weekly payments can reduce the need to keep a larger dead cash pile in a checking account. In both cases, the rhythm helps. But I want to draw a line here that the crowd usually blurs. A weekly payment schedule is not the same thing as a weekly fortune. The first one is real. The second one is usually bait. That is why the first part of a serious income strategy should not be built on speculative equity premium, leverage you do not understand, or option structures you could not explain calmly to your spouse in 2 minutes. It should be built on the highest quality cash engine available to ordinary investors. In the reference document, the first set of tools are Treasury-based weekly ETFs. That is exactly where I would begin. Why? Because before you ask capital to grow fast, you ask it to become dependable. And short-dated U.S. government obligations, whatever one thinks of politicians, remain among the simplest and most understood cash engines on earth. You are not relying on some glamorous founder. You are not relying on sentiment. You are not relying on a turnaround story. You are collecting interest from the government's need to borrow short-term money. There is no romance in that. Good romance belongs in songs, not in the part of a portfolio you intend to use as a cash floor. Take the weekly Treasury ladder idea from the document. A fund holding very short-term Treasury bills and paying out every Friday is not trying to make you rich this year. It is trying to do something much more useful. It is trying to make a portion of your money calm. Calm money has enormous value. Calm money gives you optionality. Calm money lets you wait. Calm money keeps you from touching better assets. When those better assets are temporarily sick, people underestimate how much wealth is preserved simply by not being forced into stupid action. If I place $50,000 into a modest weekly Treasury product, yielding somewhere around the high 3% to low 4% range, I am not pretending I have found the secret to empire building. I am buying weekly breathing room. I am buying a stream of cash that is unlikely to disappear because some software company missed earnings or some fashionable story cracked. That stream may only cover a utility bill, part of groceries, a tank of gas, a subscription list, or some other ordinary recurring expense. Do not laugh at that. A portfolio becomes stronger the moment even one ordinary life expense no longer depends on selling risk assets. One bill covered by dependable income is not trivial. It is strategic. The next tool in the document is a government money market ETF built to comply with strict liquidity and quality rules. Again, this is not the kind of thing people brag about at parties. That is part of its beauty, I think, of that category as reserve cash that refuses to stay lazy. Most people split their world too crudely. They have checking on one side and risk assets on the other. Either the money sits still and slowly gets insulted by inflation, or it gets thrown into assets that swing around enough to make them nervous. A well-designed money market ETF paying weekly lets some of that reserve cash behave with more dignity. It remains highly liquid, highly defensive, and still productive. That can matter a great deal for a family with real obligations. If I know I need money for taxes next month, for a roof repair next quarter, or for some other inevitable life event, that money does not belong in a story stock. It does not belong in a high-octane income product. It belongs somewhere I can trust. If that trust also hands me a weekly payment, even better. The document also mentions a newer actively managed Treasury bill ladder that interests me for a different reason. Whenever rates shift, an active short-duration manager may be able to adapt more quickly than a rigid structure. I would not blindly assume active is better. Most people who say the word active as if it were magic are usually selling something. But I do understand why someone might want a second foundational bucket alongside a more straightforward weekly Treasury fund. Diversification inside the floor matters too. People hear diversification and immediately think countries, sectors, and asset classes. That is useful in the growth side of a portfolio. But diversification inside the income floor can matter just as much. Different structures, slightly different durations, slightly different management approaches, yet all still anchored to high-quality government exposure. That is sensible. Sensible does not excite the internet. Sensible quietly saves people from making desperate decisions. Then there is the leveraged long-duration Treasury weekly payer mentioned in the document. I want to slow down here because this is where many investors become confused. They see the word Treasury and assume safety. That is a category mistake. Credit safety and price stability are not the same thing. Long-term government bonds can be credit safe and still move sharply when interest rates change. Add leverage and the movement becomes more dramatic. So a weekly payer built on longer duration bonds with leverage is no longer simply part of the floor. It is a rate bet wearing a weekly income costume. That does not make it evil. It makes it different. If I own something like that, I would size it as a satellite, not as a foundation. It might belong in a portfolio if I had a clear view on rates, real tolerance for volatility, and enough humility to keep it small. But I would never confuse it with the instruments meant to cover ordinary living expenses. This distinction is everything. You must know whether you are buying a floor or a forecast. A weekly Treasury ladder is a floor. A leveraged longer duration Treasury product is partly a forecast. Mix those up and you can make a very respectable looking mess. Now let me give you the deeper principle underneath all of this. A serious income portfolio should be built in layers. The first layer is the weekly floor. The second layer is the weekly amplifier. The third layer is the speculative engine. Most people build it upside down. They begin with the speculative engine because the payout looks exciting. Then when volatility arrives, they discover that what they thought was income was really just capital being pushed through a blender. The payout survives for a while. The principal does not. Soon enough, they are back where they started, except now they are poorer and more cynical. I prefer to build from necessity upward. First, ask what expenses must be covered, no matter what. Second, ask what portion of those expenses can be tied to the safest weekly cash generators available. Third, only after that, ask where you want to add higher yielding, higher volatility, more tactical exposures. That order changes everything. It changes what you buy, it changes how much you buy, it changes how long you can hold, and most importantly, it changes whether a bad quarter becomes a survivable inconvenience or a permanent wound. The reference document also raises something I wish more people understood. Taxes do not care about your excitement income from Treasury-based funds is generally ordinary income for federal tax purposes that matters. A payout that feels generous can look much less generous if you ignore the tax treatment. There is, however, a useful twist. Treasury interest often carries state and local tax advantages compared with other kinds of interest income. For a person in a high-tax state, that can meaningfully improve the real after-tax result. That is what grown-up investing looks like, not chasing the loudest number, comparing what actually ends up in your pocket. You would be amazed how many people chase a bigger pre-tax yield only to discover that a slightly lower number from a cleaner source was the better deal all along. Every wealthy investor I know eventually stops worshiping the headline and starts respecting the after-tax, after-fee, after-behavior result. That is the only result that counts. Now I want to say something that may sound severe, but I mean it kindly. Do not use a weekly payment schedule as an excuse to become lazy in your analysis. Frequency is not quality. A Friday payment is not automatically superior to a monthly payment if the underlying structure is weak, expensive, or slowly eroding your principal. I would rather receive a slower, sturdier stream from a sound engine than a louder stream from a machine eating itself. Income investing is full of people who mistake distribution for value creation. Sometimes the money being paid to you is genuinely earned. Sometimes it is mostly a transfer that leaves the underlying asset no stronger than before. Sometimes it is a premium for real risk that you do not fully appreciate until the bad month arrives. And sometimes it is nothing more than a seductive tempo attached to a structure that will not age well. So I return to the weekly floor because it forces clarity. What is this money for? If the answer is groceries, taxes, medicine, rent, utilities, or the basic dignity of not selling the wrong asset at the wrong time, then the weekly floor belongs in the safest section of the capital stack. If the answer is higher future income and tactical upside, that belongs elsewhere. If the answer is speculation, call it speculation. Honesty in labeling is one of the cheapest forms of risk management I know. Let me show you how I would think about a real person building this. Suppose a man in his early 60s has some retirement savings, a paid-off car, a few ordinary bills, and the usual fear that one ugly market year could force him into bad decisions. He does not need his whole portfolio to sing. He needs a portion of it to show up. I would not begin by asking how to maximize yield. I would begin by asking what number must arrive each week to reduce fear. Maybe it is $100, maybe it is $300, maybe it is more. The point is not to start with fantasy. The point is to identify the amount at which behavior changes, the amount at which he stops checking prices in a panic, the amount at which he stops treating every market dip like a threat to his dinner table. That is the real starting point. Then I would size the weekly floor accordingly using the highest quality weekly cash tools first. After that, if he wanted more income, I would still move carefully. Maybe a little more rate-sensitive exposure, maybe eventually some option income products or covered call structures, but never before the floor was in place. Never before the essentials were separated from the ambitions. Because once your essentials are financed by a sturdier stream, you gain a rare privilege in markets: patience. Patience is not just a virtue, it is an asset, and dependable weekly cash can buy you more of it. Now let us talk about younger investors, because this subject is not only for retirees. A younger investor may hear all this and think, I do not need weekly income, I need growth, perhaps. But growth without liquidity discipline often produces fragility dressed as confidence. There is nothing wrong with a younger investor using small weekly treasury positions as a parking lot for reserves, opportunity capital, or near-term obligations. In fact, that discipline can improve the entire portfolio. It keeps emergency cash productive. It reduces the urge to dip into equity positions for short-term needs. It teaches the mind that capital can have different jobs. One pile fights inflation through long-term ownership. Another pile protects flexibility. Another pile pays weekly. Another pile waits for opportunity. A mature investor eventually learns that good allocation is not merely about what will go up the most. It is about assigning the right mission to the right dollar. The reference document tries to build toward a three-tier portfolio. I think that instinct is correct, even if I would use my own language for it. Tier 1 is the floor. Tier 2 is the income amplifier. Tier 3 is the risk appetite. If Tier 1 is weak, Tier 2 becomes dangerous and Tier 3 becomes reckless. If Tier 1 is strong, Tier 2 becomes useful and Tier 3 becomes optional. That is how real wealth should feel, not like constant urgency, like controlled choice. There is also another subtle benefit to weekly payments that deserves more attention. They make progress visible. A person saving and investing often suffers from a motivation problem. The horizon is long, the rewards are delayed, and the effort can feel abstract. A weekly deposit into the account, even a modest one, teaches the nervous system something important. Capital is working, it is not just sitting there, it is producing. That visible rhythm can reinforce good behavior in a way annualized return charts never will. I never dismiss the psychological side of finance. The best system is not merely the mathematically elegant one, it is the one a human being can actually stick with. Weekly cash flow, when built on a sound base, can make a person more consistent, more patient, and less likely to sabotage themselves in search of excitement that matters. Now I should say one more thing plainly. The presence of weekly paying Treasury ETFs does not mean the old truths disappeared. You still need diversification. You still need long-term equity exposure if you want real growth. You still need inflation awareness. You still need to respect fees. You still need to understand taxation. You still need to avoid oversized bets. And you still need to remember that no income stream is a substitute for clear thinking. But if you ask me what mistake most people make when they approach income investing, I would answer without hesitation. They try to build a mansion before they pour the slab. The slab is the weekly floor. The floor is what lets the rest of the structure stand. Without it, they end up chasing whatever payout is fashionable, believing that the right yield number will solve what is really a sequencing and behavior problem. It rarely does. A strong weekly floor does not make you rich overnight. It does something better. It makes you durable enough to stay in the game long enough for your better assets to do their work. That is a much bigger advantage than it sounds. I have seen fortunes built by intelligent aggression. I have seen fortunes preserved by disciplined caution, but the happiest wealthy people I know combined the two. They built aggressive compounding engines, yes, but they also built quiet systems that kept ordinary life from interfering with extraordinary patience. This subject belongs in that second category. Not glamorous, not loud, not likely to dominate a cocktail party, but deeply useful. If I were advising someone serious in 2026, I would tell them to stop asking the market for a miracle and start asking their portfolio for a structure. How much of your life can be covered by a weekly floor? How much fear would disappear if basic expenses were no longer tied to selling stocks? How much patience would you gain if Friday cash flow kept showing up whether the headlines were cheerful or ugly? How much better would your decisions become if your safe capital had a defined job and your growth capital was finally free to stay invested? Those are the right questions. The wrong question is usually some variation of what pays the most right now. That question creates tourists. The right questions create owners, and owners last longer. So here is the operating system I would use. First, identify the non-negotiable expenses that make you vulnerable to bad timing. Second, calculate what portion of those expenses you want covered by weekly cash flow. Third, use the cleanest, shortest duration, government-backed weekly pay structures to build that base first. Fourth, understand the tax treatment before you congratulate yourself on the yield. Fifth, treat longer duration or leveraged weekly products as satellites, not foundations. Sixth, only after the weekly floor exists should you move into more aggressive income layers. Seventh, never confuse a payment schedule with proof of safety. And eighth, remember that the goal is not to feel rich on Friday. The goal is to remain rational on Monday, calm on Wednesday, and unforced on the next bad market day. That is what the weekly floor is really buying you. It is buying you time. It is buying you behavior. It is buying you the right not to liquidate good assets under bad conditions. That is a very high quality, right? I have spent my life trying to own assets that let me make decisions from strength instead of pressure. Weekly Treasury income is not the whole answer. It is not supposed to be. But for the investor who understands its role, it can become one of the smartest pieces on the board. Not because it is exciting, because it is useful, not because it promises abundance. Because it prevents compounding from being interrupted by panic. And not because it turns every Friday into a celebration, because it turns every ugly market week into something more manageable. That is enough for me. In fact, for a certain slice of capital, that is exactly what I want. If you build that floor first, then when you finally move into the amplifiers and more aggressive income engines, you do it from a position of control. You are no longer begging the market to fund your next grocery trip. You are asking the market to grow your future while the floor handles the present. That is the point. The floor handles the present. The growth engines build the future. And the man who finally understands the difference has stopped gambling with his life and started designing it. That is where real wealth begins. But let me push this one level deeper, because most investors stop too early. They hear the phrase safe weekly income and immediately assume the job is done. It is not. A floor is not a full house. A floor is a foundation for decision making. If your floor covers 20% of your needs, your psychology changes a little. If it covers 40%, your psychology changes a lot. If it covers 60%, you stop reacting to every market headline like a hunted animal. And if it covers the full amount of your core expenses, the entire character of your portfolio changes. Growth positions can be left alone. Tax decisions improve. Rebalancing becomes more rational. You can look at lower prices and see opportunity instead of danger. That is why I would never mock a person for starting with only $100 or $500 or a few thousand. The crowd likes to treat small beginnings as unimportant. I do not. Small beginnings are where discipline becomes visible. $100 in a weekly pay structure is not about the money. It is about installing the identity. It is a declaration that some piece of your capital will be assigned to certainty, not to drama. The same person who learns to respect that small weekly stream will often become the same person who later respects taxes, risk sizing, emergency reserves, and patient accumulation. These things travel together. And the opposite is also true. The person who starts by chasing only the loudest yield is usually telling you a lot about how they will behave later when volatility arrives. They will chase, they will average down without thought, they will confuse movement with progress, and then they will call the market unfair when the bill finally arrives. Markets can be cruel, but they are not usually mysterious. They simply punish people who ask a tool to do a job it was never built to do. A short-duration government-backed weekly ETF is not built to make you wealthy by itself. It is built to reduce timing pressure. A money market ETF is not built to deliver heroic returns. It is built to hold liquid capital with dignity. A longer duration leveraged treasury payer is not built to behave like cash. It is built to express a view on the path of rates while still paying on a weekly rhythm. Once you understand each tool as true job, the whole subject becomes far less confusing. Then comes the identity flip. And this is the part many investors need more than another ticker. Most savers think like employees of their own money. They deposit cash, they wait, they hope, they react. What I want is for you to become the landlord of your capital. A landlord thinks differently. A landlord does not ask, how exciting is this building today? A landlord asks, what rent does it produce? How reliable is the tenant? What is the maintenance burden, and how exposed am I to unpleasant surprises? That is the correct mindset for the weekly floor. You are not trying to win a beauty contest. You are trying to own a tiny cash flow property inside your portfolio that sends you rent every Friday. Once you adopt that mentality, the temptation to chase nonsense falls dramatically. You stop asking for spectacle. You start asking for reliability. Reliability may not make for a viral clip, but reliability is what keeps capital compounding when excitement has already blown itself up. The document also hints at something else that is worth respecting. There is a difference between income that helps you sleep and income that seduces you into taking more risk than your life can carry. That difference is not visible in the marketing language. It is visible only when you study the source, the fee structure, the duration, the leverage, the tax treatment, and the behavior of the product during stress. That is work. Real investing always includes work. Anybody who wants the reward without the work is not really asking for wealth. They are asking for luck with a nicer label. I do not build my life on luck, and I would not tell you to build yours that way either. So if I were sitting across from you with a yellow legal pad and a cup of coffee, this is the blueprint I would hand you. Write down your monthly non-negotiables, then convert them into weekly reality, because that is how pressure is felt. Identify which of those items create the most anxiety when markets swing. Choose a target number that would change your behavior if it showed up every Friday. Build toward that number using only the safest weekly pay structures first. Reinvest until the floor is meaningful. Then decide whether you are still solving for safety, for flexibility, or for amplified income. Only after that should you even look at the louder products, and even then you size them like a sober adult, not like a gambler trying to recover lost time. Time is not recovered by recklessness. It is recovered by consistency. That is another hard truth people do not enjoy hearing. A weekly floor will not erase 10 years of poor saving. It will not rescue a person who spends every raise. It will not compensate for a total lack of long-term equity exposure. It will not turn a careless investor into a wise one by magic. But it can do something valuable. It can create a pocket of order inside a financial life that is otherwise too dependent on market mood. Order is underrated. Order lowers fear. Lower fear improves decisions. Better decisions compound. That chain is not flashy, but it is real. I have built enough businesses and studied enough balance sheets to know that very few enduring successes are born from chaos. They are born from systems that keep working when conditions are not ideal. That is exactly what the weekly floor should be. A system that keeps working when conditions are not ideal. And that is why I take it seriously. Not as a replacement for ownership, not as a replacement for broad market compounding, not as a replacement for business building, but as a support beam. And a support beam that stops the roof from collapsing is not boring to me. It is valuable. The crowd will always prefer the dramatic story. The dramatic story is more fun to tell. Yet if you look closely at lives that actually become wealthy and stay wealthy, you will usually find a lot of unglamorous beams hidden behind the polished exterior. Cash reserves, insurance, conservative debt decisions, tax awareness, diversification, cash flow buffers, processes that prevent forced selling. This subject belongs in that family. So when somebody asks me whether a weekly Treasury ETF can make them rich, my answer is no. But if they ask whether a weekly floor can make them sturdier, calmer, harder to panic, less likely to sell good assets at a bad moment, and more capable of letting the real engines of wealth do their work, my answer is yes. And that yes matters much more. Because a great many fortunes are not lost from lack of opportunity. They are lost because the owner had no floor under their behavior. Build that floor first, then let the rest of your portfolio climb from there.